Our next guest has a fascinating background. He had a career in the United States Coast Guard, and while he was doing that too, he spent some time working with various tribes here in the northwestern states. And he also has a background in his family. I would put it this way: there's more DNA in his family, indigenous DNA, than in Elizabeth Warren's family. Uh, he also has been a columnist for CNS News. And as I say, a very, very varied background, but he's also heavily researched the word Redskins and also the usage of it by sports teams in the United States. And there was the big case a few years ago where the Obama White House tried to remove the trademark from the Washington Redskins and did not go well for the effort on the politically correct at the time to try and do that. His name is Andre Bilodeau, and he's joining us this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com, and we're at 67, and it's 7 minutes after 9 o'clock. First of all, welcome to our program, sir.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's good to join you from approximately 14 miles west of the U.S. White House, the capital of this nation, Washington, D.C. Thanks
Beautiful
for having
area.
me.
I bicycled
It
through there
really
one
is.
time, yeah. And I wanted to maybe open this up a little bit. One of the reasons that you got in touch with me is you happened to see a post I put up a few days ago at Teton High School. And as I've been telling listeners, you've got a lot of people who are now settling in that part of Idaho who, if they couldn't afford a home in Jackson, they bought one on this side of the mountain range, and they're coming here from other parts of the country, and they're objecting to the name of the high school teams are known as the Redskins, and people are objecting to that. And within a few weeks, it'll be in early July, there's going to be a meeting there. The school board is holding a meeting to get public input on this, and it could end up resulting in the name being dropped in usage. And Andre, you're not specifically delving into that story, but you're looking at this issue more generally, and you have been looking at it more generally because you played a role in that trademark case, as I understand it, uh, and 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 specifically, you look at the history of this and say this idea that this is somehow a slur is not historically accurate.
Yeah, I think starting from your reference to your story the other day, the picture in that story, Bill, was of a U.S. senator, a Democrat, and she's with the president of the National Congress of American Indians. And I think that gives us the background for the whole storyline. That what's happened is this story, the attack on the name, has evolved into a very vociferous political fight, with the Democrats lining up behind the it's a slur subjective use, whereas I think the rank and file natives, Republicans, conservatives, libertarians see it for what it is. It's truly an objective name with a fascinating, important history. And ultimately, based on what we saw with the trademark case back in 2014, 2015, and the construct of our amicus brief, that ultimately in the trademark world, if you don't defend your name or your trademark or your brand, it has a chance of being diminished. And so what we see in the brief against the name, and I'm going to read a sentence here real quick from their petition to change and remove the trademark rights. They claim that the complete drop-off in usage of Redskins as a reference to Native Americans beginning in the 1960s, unquote, gave them standing. And in that, the appeal was won by the Redskins. We were partnered with the ACLU, by the way, as a First Amendment right. What we see then is a secondary strategy where there's a formal group that is going around and trying to pick off every Redskin high school in the United States, because ultimately that is a bastion of what should be understanding of what the Redskins' objective term is, both as an adjective and as a noun. But if they can go around and pick these off, then they have what's called an ad populum argument, in that they can point and say all these other schools dropped the racist term. Therefore, we have a large composite of Americans and Native Americans who find it offensive. Well, that's just not the case, because in almost every case where they've been successful at dropping a Redskin case, both the community and the Native population at large agree 80 to 90% that it's not offensive and that it shouldn't be dropped. And so it's a false argument against a trademark movement that has failed. And then secondarily, we see that the DNC through the Center of American Progress, which is chaired by John Podesta, amongst other people, has been mailing these booklets, these training booklets, these campaign booklets, not just anti-Redskin, but anti-every other Native name, chiefs, braves, you name it, in developing a sense of tension that these names shouldn't be in the public school system or used at all. And they're trying to capture, by their own memo, ultimately 4.7 million Native American votes that they have documented as being under, that the natives aren't voting up to the level of, let's say, Hispanic or Black votes. So they've pigeonholed Native Americans. They have identified a way to it. They call it empower, and that is to attack these names and remove the names to get out the vote. And this has all been documented and cited and sourced. And if you just look a little deeper, you kind of see the motivations of what's happening. But certainly the name Redskins has been misused in the past, sometimes subjectively, but it's always almost 100% referred to simply a Native American warrior, of which the name originally got its use on the East Coast by use of the body paints and spiritual connective red paints used by the warriors of that region.
In fact, you mentioned you sent the brief to me, and it's a friend of a court brief, I believe, and you sent that to me, and I was looking through it, and many of the tribal chiefs and elders, even going back hundreds of years, when they were dealing with the Europeans and the colonialists who were moving into North America, referred to themselves as Redskins.
Yeah, and that's a fact. And even the French, who had claimed upwards of a third of the continent, were probably the first to use the name as Peau Rouge, simply, again, objectively meaning one with red skin. And the academia behind this is pretty clear. As recently as 2014, the Oxford Dictionary, for instance, very clearly lays out the case that the term redskin does not talk about a racial skin color, but specifically the paint used by Algonquin warriors and other peoples that ultimately migrated west, in that they used these body paints in spiritual connection with the Great Spirit before they went to battle or for adoptions. And what we have, I've got 14 anthropologists who are on the record, the American Museum of Natural History, support that adjective notion that Redskins as a warrior term is specific to those who paint their skin. Now, let's look at American entomology. The word Delaware, I guess you lived in Delaware for a time, if I'm not mistaken.
7 years, yeah.
In Spanish, Delaware it can be mistaken as of the war. And there are some historians that believe that the term Delaware, thought of as of the war, is specific to the Delaware natives. The Lenape, in their own language, Lenape became Delaware, which is specific to Redskins. They are identified as being one of the premium users of the red paints, the bloodroot, and to have the first state in our nation ultimately named after a Redskin tribe, the Delaware, of which there's the word usage which suggests that they're preparing for war. Now, even the state next door to Idaho, in Wyoming, the Wyoming Valley, it's named after the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania, which was primarily settled by the Delaware Lenape natives, Redskin natives. So what you have right next door in Wyoming is a state that reflects upon a Redskin history of the United States. Idaho, on the other hand, is believed to be the term in native language for enemy, specific to the Comanche, who used to do raids up in the southern part of the state. Now, Comanche are also a Redskin tribe, aggressively using red paint before going to war, and they're seen as some of the finest warriors on the continent. And I say this specifically because the U.S. Rangers, for instance, our special forces of this country, trace their fighting abilities and their doctrine back to a gentleman named Church, wherein Church's Rangers were the British who learned their woodland fighting skills specifically from Redskin warriors, meaning that these warriors earned their paint. You didn't just have red skin as an option as a warrior. You actually had to earn it. And so that they were regiments of Redskin warriors and Church's Rangers, ultimately becoming Rogers Rangers, ultimately becoming the doctrine for the U.S. Special Forces Rangers. It's fascinating when you think about it. But the name carries a lot of tradition and pride with the United States.
And we've got about, before we get to our first break, we've got about 3 minutes. We have hundreds, if you think about it that way, hundreds of tribes that existed across North America. And to sit here and think that just because, I think I told you in an email the other day, I befriended Vernon Bellecourt back in the 1990s. And he was working against the use of these names, Chiefs, Braves, Redskins. He was at least civil about it. I found him to be a very nice human being. But the fact of the matter is, Vernon didn't necessarily. I even had Onondagas who told me that he didn't necessarily represent their viewpoint. So to try to say that just because someone is known as an American Indian, it's a bit like saying European. You know, you've got many different nationalities, languages, and countries there.
Right, and I think one of the problems is that those who are kind of uneducated on the issue consider Indians as all natives, which is a monolithic idea that doesn't hold water. It's like saying a Portuguese person is the same as somebody from Romania, Norway, or Morocco, just because they're in the same region. The Native American composite offers, I think there's upwards of 200 languages and subdialects, and we have approximately 600 recognized tribes at the federal and state level, and each tribe has its own identity. So if you look at Redskinism as a practice, not all tribes practice that. It depended on many variables, such as we see that there's many Redskin high schools exactly on top of areas where Redskinism was practiced. The burial mounds of the Mississippian culture, which yielded giant caches of red dyes that cover everything from the body to the weapons, is essentially a kind of a spiritual tool to get them into the next world, whereas red is seen as a sacred color. And then you look at who has standing in the argument, and this is another, I think, misused by those who would try to do away with the Redskins, is that DNA tests done in the last 6 months, for instance, bombshell studies by both Harvard and subsidiary research done, shows that with 160,000 samples of U.S. DNA, they found that more than 50% of what we would call a European American actually carry native DNA. Some more than others, but certainly you can look at that as, if you're going to make the argument that only natives have an argument, then I would ask the opposition to draw the line at what point in what used to be the one drop rule with the Democrats, at what point do you not have standing? And so with the majority of Americans being found to have native DNA, the argument needs to be then matured enough to say, okay, who doesn't have standing? Now, there's a third avenue of this argument by which our own U.S. Constitution.
Well, hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought for a moment. We've got to get to a break, but we've got more coming up with Andre Bilodeau, talking about the use of the word Redskins, and this comes about not directly, but it's related to a piece that I posted last week at our website about Teton High School under pressure to drop the Redskins name. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, it's 68. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. I do want to mention temperatures today should get to 85. 9:22, and we're at 66 on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Our guest, Andre Bilodeau, has written extensively on the use of the word Redskins, its historical origins, as well as its applications today, where it's used in many cases as a name of various sports teams and affiliated with many high schools across the country. We're at 9:22, just about 9:22. Bill Colley with you as well on Magic Valley this morning. You were just getting to a third point before we went to break. Can you finish that?
Yeah, Bill. What I was saying is the argument afoot around the country is who has standing in this argument. And you'll find that those who would wish to change the name, they want to stand with a decision made by the NCAI as tribal elected members have made the decree, and they stand in with the Democrat Party, essentially, that these names should not be used. But ultimately, my point was the representation of the average American in any given school is more than half Native. We know that now by the blockbuster 2018 research done by Harvard, that the average American does carry Native DNA. And what I'm suggesting here further is that by virtue of being an American, those who pledge allegiance to the Constitution as a new citizen or those born into citizenship have the gift of the U.S. Constitution. I noticed your last guest talked about the Constitution and the unity behind it, that we share this document. I think the best story never told in America right now, especially at these schools that have Native themes, is that the Constitution is primarily a gift from some of the greatest thinkers and leaders in history, those who came from the Iroquois Confederacy. What they developed before the Europeans showed up was essentially a bottom-up system of governance, and we call it today federalism. And within that federalism came several ways of governance by which the United States has adopted. And it's recognized, the U.S. Congress recognized this in 1988 with a joint resolution at the House and Senate that the Great Law of Peace is the backbone and the founding document of our U.S. Constitution. By virtue of it being a hybrid native law, set of laws, there's 117 bylaws in the Great Law of Peace. Anybody who pledges allegiance to the United States or the Constitution is essentially pledging allegiance to a hybrid native nation called the United States. Women's rights came to us from the position of power that women held in the Iroquois Confederacy. The Electoral College is carried off in the Confederacy. The upper and lower houses in an executive branch is represented in this Confederacy. The theme of a commander-in-chief absolutely is paralleled in our current military system, by which it's all volunteers. War chiefs back then were not permanent typically, and they had to convince warriors to put on the paint and go to war based on a strong narrative, a strong enough reason to potentially give up your life for the betterment of the tribe. Now, for the betterment of the tribe at the Grand Councils, they operated under a theory called what we call today N7. N7. And their decisions were made based on, will it help the generation 7 generations from now out? Will any decision we make positively influence or affect those who are yet to be born 7 generations out? And it's with that spirit I would ask the school board there in Victor, Idaho, to consider the N7 tradition and consider that I'm guessing they know very little about what the Native American Guardians Association, who are in town currently and giving a speech tonight at 7 o'clock at the high school, what they know, what I know, and what 91% of a composite of Native Americans who have no problem with the use of the name Redskin know, that the name has positive, grounded, objective truth to it. It should not be eradicated. In matter of fact, there should be a movement to increase Native American themes, images in the public sphere. And by the way, that school does not have a mascot. It does not have a mascot. And I think in that the term itself suggests that there's an unequal relationship between everyday citizen and a mascot. I agree that the term mascot can be derogatory, and the use of mascots in the 50s and 60s were often derogatory, and that really started the movement. And so we would agree that the use of mascots typically is a no-no. It's not good. It doesn't celebrate necessarily the positive culture, traditions, and the authenticness of any given tribe. There are examples where it is appropriate if the tribe is trained or sponsored, the dancer or performer. But in this case, using the term mascot by the school board or anybody else falls right into those who would change the name's narrative. It can be seen as demeaning, absolutely. So we are promoting the idea that the discussion is objective, that the word symbol is more appropriate, and that the Redskins no longer have a mascot, and they haven't had one for years. So that becomes a tripping point, and I think that most people need to understand and adhere to it. Now, I'm sorry, Bill, go ahead.
No, go ahead. We've got a couple of minutes before the break.
Yeah, the academics that these changers bring to bear come mostly from a 2005 American Psychological Association composite that they recommend schools drop mascots. And what they're talking about very specifically was research done where mascots were used. There's a Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, which is their primary authority on the issue in 2005. And she conducted a number of experiments in Arizona on a reservation and I can tell you, as a social scientist, this kind of experiment would not hold up today using humans. But now she primed these children. She primed them with the statement that most Americans essentially see you as this, and she showed them pictures of Chief Wahoo in a very cartoonish. And she suggested that to the students that most Americans know nothing about you, your culture, your traditions. And ultimately, out of them, she got sentiment along which she compiled her research and paper. But she evolved. That study was critiqued pretty aggressively, and the APA president who signed off on that study was the only APA non-psychology president. He had a doctorate in education, not psychology. But if you fast forward her research, which matured over the years, ultimately in 2008, she corrected a lot of her, I think, methodological problems, glaring methodological problems, and she ended up summarizing two issues with what she called mascots. One was to simply get rid of it, but then she opined extensively that schools could keep the mascot if they provided context in the school where any given Native American student could see that they're not represented singularly by a mascot, which isn't even the case. But if you opened up and you enhanced the context of Native America, for instance, providing more history, tradition, a wider range, perhaps enter the Navajo code talkers and maybe modern doctors. We have representatives now in Congress. So that the future self, and these are kind of her words, that a student can see their future self as being more than just, in the case of Victor, Idaho, a painted warrior.
We've got to take a short break again, Andre.
Sure.
We'll take the break and then we'll pick this conversation up afterward. Andre Bilodeau joining us this morning, 9:30, and we're at 68. The trifocals here make reading that difficult, but I think it's a 68. If it's 66, can you feel the difference? Todd Starn's on the way too on KLIX. Final half hour of Magic Valley this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Our guest, Andre Bilodeau, has been chatting with us this morning about really the history of the word Redskins. And as he pointed out, he said he doesn't like the word mascot when it comes to schools or teams. He says he looks at it more as a symbol, and giving us some of the history of the term, but also he was delving into how the other side, which would like to eliminate the name, is often in many ways using it as leverage for other purposes. 9:35, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And Andre, I think one of the things you were getting at was it sounds to me when you mentioned that they feel they could trade the name for some leverage in more courses dedicated to the history of the various tribes, almost as if some of these schools are being blackmailed.
Yeah, I guess my point there is that the psychologists used to make their case, they used her findings from 2005 to eradicate the names, whereas in 2008, she summarizes by saying mascots aren't the problem. So she kind of did a 180 on her own research, and ultimately she says that by providing context, ultimately positive context, and the ability for a Native student, that's their focus, that Native students would not do well in schools that had mascots. But by providing a broader array of context, Native American history, artifacts, a modern look at Native American leaders, would provide a stable and balanced school for Native students and be more inclusive. Now, that model has been embraced by Neshaminy Redskin High School in Pennsylvania, for instance. They have kind of a ladder set up with their curricula by which students as early as second grade are assigned research on different tribes so that we kind of get away from that monolithic mindset, which is wrong. They learn that there's many different tribes and cultures in North America as there was in Europe or Africa or anywhere else, and that they're not monolithic. And then on through field trips and discussion groups, and ultimately they provide a very balanced visual context at the school to include, they have a Lenape statue in the entrance of the school, looking up to the creator, palms facing upwards, and they even cut a sun hole in the roof there to make the connection with the Great Spirit. There's plaques, there's honorifics throughout the school, images, even the tribute to the United States military, by which, Bill, the Native American population in this country are the largest contingent of volunteers into the U.S. military, that they overrepresent any other average demographic. I think that's amazing. And it kind of gets to the ethos of the original. I talk about the constitutional ethos and the tribes that helped create the Constitution, where being a thinker, being a statesman is honored, but ultimately their elections were decided as much as how good of a warrior were you, you know. And so warrior ethos are held in very high esteem, and you see that essentially through the volunteerism and the patterns of volunteering into the U.S. military. And again, it gets real circular back to our special forces are based primarily on the woodland warfare of the Redskin warriors. So, so to offer a broader array of Native American exhibits, field trips, curricula at Teton High School is the recommended path forward by the Changers' very own psychologist. And I think, again, that's lost on school boards. They get these packages, again, from the Center for American Progress. This has been the case at other schools. Matter of fact, we just had an investigation done at Cedar City High School, known previously as the Redmen, now the Reds. But it turns out that in August 2018, a recording surfaced by which the school board, using the material sent to them by a highly political group, decided then and there they were going to make the school name something else without community input, without student input. And when the audio tape was released, ultimately one of the vote to change school board members resigned nearly immediately. As a matter of fact, tonight they're trying to hold on to some of their Native American artwork in the city by declaring it historic and important for the city of Cedar City in Utah. And that kind of leads me to my next issue and warning.
Well, hold on to that thought again. We've got another break, and then we'll pick this up again. We've got a little running room after this break until 10 o'clock this morning. Andre Bilodeau joining us, talking a bit about, and again, this was all came about from a conversation we had via email over the last week or so about what's going on at Teton High School in eastern Idaho over the name Redskins. But this is a much broader story going on and has been going on the last couple of decades in this country. It's 9:40. We're at 66. Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our guest, Andre Bilodeau, has a fascinating backstory, and that is that he made a career out of the Coast Guard, and then he also has some ancestry, and as I joked earlier in the program, considerably more indigenous ancestry than the U.S. Senator, one of the U.S. Senators from Massachusetts. And so that got his interest from a young age involved in just the word Redskins and how it is used. And we're in a battle and have been really since the 1990s, late 1990s, over the name Redskins and even the name Chiefs, the name Braves. And it's come to Idaho as one of the high schools in eastern Idaho is dealing with this. And tonight, in fact, as he pointed out, there's a meeting taking place there this evening, and then there's going to be a school board hearing on this coming up in July. We're at 9:44. It's 68 on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you until 10 a.m. And Andre, you were just, before we got to the break, you were just wrapping up another point. Do you remember what that was? I got you off point, I know, during the commercial break.
Yeah, I think that I was trying to summarize where the argument is at the school board level and some of the dangerous paths ahead for any community that rushes to a decision. I think that's where I left off, and I was pointing to Cedar City High School as ultimately what I call a victimized school, where 80 to 90% of the community was not happy at all with the rush decision made by the school board. And ultimately, when the evidence came out that they were relying on cherry-picked data provided by, an organization funded and directed in part by John, the DNC chair, as well as the failed gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, I think that really got their hackles up, and they took a real hard look at the school board and started asking questions. That's when they started bailing out. So ultimately, the 3-2 vote came where the 2 votes that were for the name came from a couple who were intellectually curious enough to go out, reach out, and ask questions. Matter of fact, I know that the Native American Guardians took some questions and calls from them, as well as myself. I talked to one of their PhD board members over a couple days who asked some very good questions, and she evaluated the answers and actually articulated exactly why she was voting to keep the name, the honorable name Redmond, at that school during the final school board meeting. And they were warned not to rush their decision in an open forum, and they changed the name quickly thereafter. And it was kind of a mistake. And now they're really paying the price down there. And ultimately, that's what we see around the country. There's been several Redskins schools that have maintained their name very positively. They've fended off the political arguments. They understood what they really were. However, the news is these schools ultimately enhance their context in line with the opposition's recommendation that you'll never see them print, but it's there. That at the end of the day, the sense of unity and finding oneness with American history, its good points and its bad, the traditions, the Constitution that the Redskin Warrior brings to bear as an identity of a school, are all very, very positive. And net result is that a community is much better served by being sensitive, understanding, unified with their name. They understand the name, and they practice elements of Native American culture, so that they are understanding of the sensitivities, the cultural limits of the names. For instance, you don't wear a war bonnet to a football game. You don't wear body paint. In the military, we call that stolen valor, and it is a valid concern. So with a little bit of forethought, some planning, and coordination with some cultural leaders, and even like the Smithsonian has traveling exhibits they could get, this could be a clearinghouse of sorts for Idaho, where students graduate with not just a sense of identity as a Redskin warrior, with a traditional ethos, but that they have a higher understanding of a commitment to maintain a Native American footprint. The original soul of America is Native American, and that they reach that N7 future generation goal set forward by some of this continent's best leaders. And here's a for instance. In 1969, Native leaders from the Sioux tribe came together and decided it was in the best interest of their culture, traditions, identity, so that the Sioux would bequeath upon the University of North Dakota the identity of a fighting Sioux warrior, much like the Redskin warrior, and that this gift would last in perpetuity, and that it came to be over a gifting ceremony with sacred pipe usage. Now, in traditional Native law, that pipe signals essentially that the agreement through the smoking, and then the rising of the smoke reaches the Great Spirit, and then it's a forever gift. Now, this gift was challenged at the university in the mid-2000s by essentially a posse of white liberal professors, and they challenged the Sioux Nation to give up their name, to give up their gift. And ultimately, the state supported the Sioux Nation, and they even had a vote where a supermajority of the tribal members up there voted to keep their name. And yet, politics turned that whole thing around, and they eradicated that name. Now, if you look at the University of North Dakota, if you look at their fundraising, their attendance records, and the loss of some of their sports teams, they're suffering now. When they got rid of their identity, wrongfully, in my opinion, there's byproducts, and they're suffering. If you look at their fundraising efforts just to keep their sporting programs alive, the loss of revenue. There's an artist, a Chippewa artist, who designed their symbol. His name is Bennett Brienne. It was an all hands on deck effort at a tradition to carry on the tradition, and it was stopped suddenly. That town still hasn't recovered, and the school is suffering. I've seen the same thing at these other high schools. We had a school in Lancaster, one of the first victims of this movement, which essentially started in the run-up to the 2012 presidential elections, that these high schools would be attacked. But one of the early victims is Lancaster High School. They were the Redskins. They immediately, the community protested aggressively. Kids were running out of class, kind of like what happened at Victor, Idaho. And it was a mess. And immediately, the Obama administration engaged the Secretary of Education to weigh in. You had a Native gaming leader up there who was part of essentially the DNC putting pressure on the school. And ultimately, they got another school not to play him in lacrosse, and the school board rushed to a decision to get rid of the name. Well, those who voted to get rid of the name were immediately bounced out of their seats, and the town's never been the same. As a matter of fact, their fundraising, for a couple of years, they were expecting to fundraise for their sports programs close to $1 million. And once they changed the name, they're now some kind of knight. I'll call it a mascot in this case, is a knight in shining armor. That has no identity with North America. There weren't any knights, fighting for freedom or fighting to maintain their identity in North America, and yet there they are. They're completely they disengaged years of tradition, years of ceremony, custom, respect, and they can't even raise funds now for their sports programs. And the community is still divided. Like I said, it's usually about 85 to 15%, and I think that's kind of the case in Teton. And the numbers are amazingly they come out almost always the same. But we also find that the more people learn, the more converts come to the aid and defense of their Native American symbol.
We got a caller.
This is a battle against ignorance at the lowest common denominator. This is a battle against ignorance.
We got a caller looking to join us, Andre. And caller, you're on the air on KLIX. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning. Well, I've always said, if you think the government's going to take care of you, just look what they've done for the Indians, and they've just tried to decimate the Indians, to steal their lands, and they called it, they wanted superiority of white man over red man and so forth, but it's just really sad. This whole division thing with these mascots, this is another example of Saul Alinsky's divide and conquer concept in this country, and it's just sad. These mascots have been around for a long time. Maybe I came from Wyoming. Maybe the Cowboys would be upset. Yeah, I mean, seriously, it's so ludicrous. It's unbelievable that, the Washington Redskins or the Teton Redskins, they need to have whatever mascot they want, And so I'm with the fact that we need to get back to common sense, and all of our American traditions and customs are under attack. It's all about the Saul Alinsky model to destroy this country.
Well, we'll get. Well, Andre, do you have a comment on his point that this is really just to divide us?
Yeah, sir. What's your name?
His name is Adrian.
Adrian. Hi. Yeah, I think what Adrian's noting is a breakdown of what we all have in our pockets, I'm guessing, or in our billfold, is a slogan known as E pluribus unum. As a national motto, it resonates. It is, from many we are one. And ultimately, we're meant to be successful as a country is to come together and have the best virtues of all subgroups, ethnicities, cultures, to build a stronger nation. And what he's saying is absolutely correct. This nation is founded under the auspices of E pluribus unum. George Washington put E pluribus unum on Native American presidential medals 3 years before it appeared on U.S. coinage, which it still appears. These presidential medals is celebrating its 230th anniversary this year, but most Americans have no idea. Now, the first medals featured identities of both natives and President Washington together in a kind of a brotherhood. And again, E pluribus unum. By design, this country is meant to stand united to absorb customs and traditions and celebrate. That makes us stronger. And so, yes, when you attack that thread of America that holds us together, and it's my argument that this is a huge thread. Once you lose that basic understanding of where we came from as a nation, that we are a combination of the best of the world, that this still is the world's best country, and to a large extent based on our absorption of Native American identity, politics, culture, ethos, that you're right. An attack on the native way, the native traditions is an attack on America. And this is dangerous, and it is a slippery slope. And it's being done primarily for political purposes. I'm not going to say the opposition doesn't have a point to make, and they do. And they should be listened to. There are certain elements in society that need to be cleaned up aggressively. But the school that in question has done a lot of that. There's more to do. let's say in the Coast Guard, if a river has some contamination, well, the first thing we do is we isolate the contamination. We don't shut down the whole river and disallow its flow. We don't disallow 98% of those who still use good water not to have any water. We isolate the contamination, and we hit the area where it's being contaminated. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, though. You know what I'm saying? This is kind of an attack
Sure.
on Native Americanism, on Redskinism, and you can see who's behind it. It's not hard to find. And so my message to the school boards, as well as to Adrian, is, Adrian, you're right. You're absolutely correct. And there is a victory on the back end of this for those who had changed the name. There's several layers of victories, and if we can talk about that openly without scare tactics, name calling, in an objective forum, I think the school and community at Victor will be much better off. That said, I highly recommend a public debate. Let the NCAI bring their best debater. By the way, they're represented by a cartoon Redskin warrior. How come they still have their logo? How come the NCAI and their friends aren't attacking Native American schools, who also feature Chiefs, Braves, and Warriors and Redskins very proudly? If there was a problem between Native students getting bad grades when there are these, what they call mascots, how come that doesn't hold true on Native American reservations? Or if it does, how come they haven't attacked the Native American schools? This is very racially polarizing, and it's not where we should be in 2019.
Andre, I got to let you go at that point, okay. But quickly, I mentioned you've written for CNS, but for people who'd like to know more, any particular website you'd recommend that they check out?
Yeah, let me give you two, Bill. Thank you for asking. The Native American Guardians Association, I think they're one of the most important movements in this country right now, and they operate off volunteerism and donations. So give them a visit, naguardians.org, and as well as my book website. If people want to go there and ask me questions, I can give them the materials I spoke of. But that's redskinsname.com, www.redskinsname.com. I'll be happy to answer questions or provide more information. And I do challenge that school board not to make a sudden name change. Let's have a debate.
Outstanding. Hey, we may be talking again next month after they meet, so I'll look forward to that.
Very good, Bill. Thank you, and thank you to your listeners.
Hey, thank you. Take care. Andre Bilodeau joining us this morning. And as I said, he's got a long-time interest in this name because of his own ancestry, as well as long-time Redskins fan. And that part of the country that is like a religion in some cases. I'm not disparaging religion. I'm just telling you it's very important to people in certain areas of Northern Virginia and Maryland. Coming up on a break for news at 10 o'clock. Also wanted to mention, too, Rush Limbaugh is on the way. Rush will be here from 10 o'clock until 1 p.m. God willing, and the creek don't rise, I'm back here tomorrow morning between 6 and 10 a.m. And just a rundown, Idaho Fish and Game tomorrow, Idaho State Police tomorrow, and Pastors Roundtable.